There is a certain kind of silence that exists only in a school after the final bell has rung. It is a hollow, echoing quiet, where the ghosts of the day's laughter and shouted conversation seem to linger in the dusty air. For Emma Hale, this silence was not empty, it was her kingdom. It was within this orderly calm that she built her life, brick by careful brick. Her world was one of clear rules, predictable outcomes, and the quiet satisfaction of being the very best. She was the girl with the perfect notes, the unwavering hand, and a future so meticulously planned it was less a dream and more a blueprint. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that this careful architecture of achievement was the only thing that stood between her and the chaos of the world. She moved through the hallways not just as a student, but as its quiet, unseen queen, certain that her control was absolute and her path was secure. It is a beautiful, fragile thing, the tower one builds for oneself, often unaware of the single, specific tremor that can bring it all down. For Emma, that tremor had a name, and it walked into her life not as a storm, but as a quiet, confident shift in the atmosphere. It arrived in the form of a new literature teacher, a man whose very presence seemed to challenge the silence she cherished, replacing it with a low, humming tension that would soon become the soundtrack to her undoing. The story of a model student and the one person who could make her forget every rule she ever lived by was not written in the loud, dramatic moments, but in the quiet, dangerous spaces in between. The late summer sun poured through the tall, paned windows of the classroom, casting long, lazy rectangles of light across the scuffed linoleum floor. It was a light that held onto the warmth of the season just past, a light that felt nostalgic even as it illuminated the beginning of something new. For Emma Hale, this first day was not a beginning but a continuation, the next logical, well-ordered step in the blueprint of her life. She sat with a posture so perfect it seemed innate, her hands folded neatly on the desk, her binder open to a fresh, blank page already labeled literature, semester 1 in her precise, looping script. Around her, the room buzzed with the low, nervous energy of students reacquainting themselves after a long break, a sound that to Emma was merely background noise to her own focused preparation. She was the calm at the center of the high school hurricane, a girl who found her power not in loudness, but in a quiet, unshakable competence that teachers admired and peers respected. She was class president, top of her class, a figure whose reliability was as certain as the ringing of the school bell. Her world was built on a foundation of rules, and as long as she followed them, she believed herself to be untouchable, safe within the walls of her own impeccable achievements. The clock above the door ticked its way toward the hour, each second a metronome counting down to the start of her final year. This was her territory, this room, these hallways. She knew the rhythm of the school day like her own heartbeat, and she took comfort in its predictable patterns. Then, a change in the air. The door, which had been propped open with a worn-out textbook, swung wider, and the principal, Mr. Davies, walked in, his presence causing a gradual hush to fall over the room. But it was the figure who followed him that made the last of the chatter die away completely. He was not the aging, tweed-jacketed professor Emma had expected for a senior literature class. This man was young, perhaps in his late 20s, and he carried himself with an easy confidence that was immediately captivating. He didn't hover nervously by the door but moved to the side of the principal's desk, leaning against it casually as Mr. Davies began to speak, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, appraising intelligence. "Class, settle down," Mr. Davies said, his voice a familiar drone. "I'd like to introduce you to your new literature teacher for this semester, Mr. Hart. Mr. Hart comes to us with an impressive background, and I expect you all to give him your full attention and respect." A few polite, curious murmurs rippled through the room. Emma, however, felt her pen go still in her hand. Her eyes, usually so disciplined in their focus, were locked on him. He was handsome, certainly, in a way that was both classic and entirely unsettling. He had dark, well-defined brows and hair that looked as if he'd run his hands through it once or twice on his way to class. But it was more than that. It was the way he occupied the space, a quiet authority that didn't need to be announced. He wasn't trying to command their attention, he simply had it. As Mr. Davies left with a final nod, Mr. Hart pushed himself off the desk and stood before them. He wasn't tall in an intimidating way, but his presence seemed to fill the front of the room. He picked up a piece of chalk, his fingers long and purposeful, and without looking at the board, wrote his name in a clean, sharp script, asterisk Mr. Hart star. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was the second surprise. It was a warm, resonant baritone, the kind of voice that wasn't raised but simply asterisk projected asterisk, wrapping around the words and giving them a weight and a texture that made you want to listen. It carried a hint of something else, too, a subtle, gravelly undertone that suggested depths of thought and experience far beyond the walls of this classroom. It was a voice that promised stories, not just lessons. He didn't start with the syllabus. He didn't start with rules. He started with a question. "What is a story?" he asked, his gaze drifting across the faces before him. "Is it just a sequence of events? Or is it something more? Is it the thing that connects us, that explains the world when the world itself refuses to make sense?" He began to pace slowly, his hands in the pockets of his dark trousers. He spoke of ancient myths, of campfire tales, of the fundamental human need to weave narrative into the chaos of existence. He wasn't lecturing, he was conversing with them, his words painting pictures that felt both grand and intimately personal. Emma found herself leaning forward slightly, her perfectly prepared notes forgotten. This was not the dry dissection of themes and motifs she was used to. This was a conversation about the very soul of why people write, and why we read. Then his eyes, a shade of deep, thoughtful brown, found hers. It was only for a second, a fleeting connection amidst his scan of the room, but it was enough to make the air catch in her lungs. In that fraction of a moment, it felt as if his question, his entire intense focus, was directed solely at her. It was a look that didn't just see a student in the front row, it felt like it saw ***, the person behind the perfect grades and the class president title. A strange, warm flush crept up her neck, and she quickly looked down at her blank page, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sensation was so foreign, so utterly disruptive to her internal order, that it felt like a small, internal earthquake. The rest of the period passed in a blur for Emma. She heard his voice, noted the way he occasionally rolled up the sleeves of his button-down shirt to reveal strong forearms as he gestured, observed the small, knowing smile he offered when a student gave a particularly insightful answer. She saw the way the morning light caught the subtle silver streaks at his temples, a contrast to his otherwise dark hair. Every detail seemed amplified, etched into her mind with a strange, hyperreal clarity. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the sound was jarring, pulling her out of a trance she hadn't even realized she was in. The spell was broken, and the room erupted into the usual cacophony of scraping chairs and gathering backpacks. Emma moved on autopilot, carefully placing her unused pen back in its case, closing her pristine binder. She was usually the first to leave, her schedule a tightly run operation of getting from one class to the next with maximum efficiency. But today, she found herself taking an extra moment, slowly zipping her back, watching him from the corner of her eye as he erased the board, his movements efficient and sure. A small, reckless thought, a thought that belonged to someone else, not to her, flickered in her mind. What if I went up and asked him about the book he mentioned? She immediately crushed it. That was not the rule. Students didn't linger without cause. It was unnecessary, it was unproductive, it was not her. She stood and joined the stream of students flowing into the hallway. The noise was overwhelming after the focused quiet of his classroom. Her best friend, Sarah, fell into step beside her, chattering about her own summer and her new classes. Emma nodded along, offering the occasional aha, but her mind was a million miles away, or more accurately, it was still back in that sun-drenched classroom, trapped in the echo of a voice that had, in the space of 50 minutes, rewritten something fundamental inside her. The blueprint of her life, once so clear, now had a smudge on it, a shadow in the shape of a man who spoke of stories as if they were alive. The orderly lines of her future suddenly seemed less straight, less certain. She had believed her control was absolute, that her fortress of achievement was impenetrable. But as she walked down the bustling hallway, the ghost of his gaze still warm on her skin, Emma Hale felt, for the very first time, the first tiny, terrifying crack begin to form in her perfect foundation. The following days unfolded with a new, peculiar rhythm, a rhythm set to the silent, insistent metronome of Emma's own heartbeat. Her world, once a sprawling map of classes, assignments, and student council meetings, had suddenly shrunk, its borders now defined by the four walls of the literature classroom and the 50-minute period she spent within them. The school itself became a mere backdrop, a series of corridors leading to the only room that felt charged with meaning. Every other subject was an echo, a dull drone she had to endure while waiting for the bell that would release her into the gravitational pull of his presence. She was living her life in a state of heightened anticipation, a constant, low-grade hum of awareness that was both exhilarating and utterly exhausting. She began to notice things, small details that she would have previously dismissed as insignificant, but now collected and turned over in her mind like precious stones. It was the specific way he would pause before answering a difficult question, his gaze turning inward as if searching for the truest possible response. It was the faint scent of old books and clean, sharp cologne that clung to the air around his desk. It was the way he would sometimes lean against the edge of his desk during a particularly passionate point, crossing his ankles, making the lesson feel less like a lecture and more like a shared discovery. She memorized the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his smile was slightly lopsided, the cadence of his voice when he read poetry aloud, transforming the printed words into something living and breathing that filled the quiet room. Her own behavior began to shift in subtle, yet telling ways. The girl who had always been content to excel quietly now found her hand shooting up with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. She volunteered to analyze complex passages, her insights sharper and more nuanced than ever before, not for the grade, but for the slow, approving nod he would give, for the way his eyes would light up with a spark of genuine intellectual respect. "A compelling interpretation, Emma," he would say, and her name on his lips felt like a reward, a secret currency that fed a hunger she didn't fully understand. She started lingering after the bell, pretending to need an extra moment to pack her bag, just to have a few more seconds in the room after the other students had spilled out into the hall. She would ask him questions about the reading, questions she already knew the answers to, simply to stand a few feet from him, to have his full, undivided attention focused solely on her for a handful of stolen seconds. It was during one of these carefully orchestrated delays that the first real shift occurred. The classroom was empty save for the two of them, the afternoon sun casting long, deep shadows across the rows of empty desks. She had asked him about the symbolism of the green light in the novel they were studying, a topic she had already written extensive notes on. He was leaning against his desk, arms crossed, considering her question with a thoughtful expression. "It's about more than just a desire for the future, I think," he mused, his eyes meeting hers. "It's about the unattainable. The beautiful, perfect idea of something that exists just out of reach. The moment you finally get it, the dream often shatters, because the dream was in the wanting." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and the air between them seemed to grow still and thick. "You have a real talent for seeing the layers in a text, Emma. It's a rare thing." The compliment was a physical warmth spreading through her chest. But it was what he said next that truly changed the trajectory of everything. "In fact," he continued, pushing off the desk and taking a step toward the bookshelf, "the school debate team is in dire need of a captain. I've been asked to coach it. It requires someone with a quick mind, a strong work ethic, and the ability to construct a persuasive argument. After watching you in class, I can't think of anyone better for the role." He turned back to her, a faint, questioning look on his face. "Would you be interested?" The question hung in the silent room. The debate team. It meant late afternoons. It meant one-on-one strategy sessions. It meant a legitimate, sanctioned reason to be alone with him, to talk about things that weren't just on the syllabus. It was an open door, and every sensible part of her screamed to shut it, to politely decline and retreat to the safety of her old life. But the part of her that had been awakened, the part that thrilled at the sound of his voice and lived for the brief intensity of his gaze, that part was already stepping through. "Yes," she heard herself say, her own voice sounding strangely steady. "I would like that very much." Her best friend, Sarah, was the first to notice the seismic shift in Emma's universe. Over lunch in the crowded cafeteria, surrounded by the clatter of trays and the buzz of 100 conversations, Sarah studied her with a narrowed, concerned gaze. "You're different," she stated bluntly, stirring her yogurt. "You're spacey. You used to be the most focused person I knew. Now, I have to say your name 3 times to get your attention. And you're always in such a hurry to get to lit class." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is this about Mr. Hart?" The directness of the question was like a splash of cold water. Emma felt a guilty flush creep up her neck. "Don't be ridiculous," she deflected, picking at her sandwich. "He's just a good teacher. The class is interesting, that's all. And I'm the debate captain now, that's a big responsibility." The excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. Sarah wasn't convinced. "Emma, be careful," she said, her tone losing its playful edge and becoming deadly serious. "I see the way you look when you talk about him. It's not just about literature. He's a teacher. This is dangerous territory." She gestured around them, at the mundane reality of the high school cafeteria. "This is our world. His is different. There are lines for a reason." Emma knew Sarah was right. Every word was a truth she was trying desperately to ignore. The lines were there, bright and bold and impossible to miss. But the pull she felt toward Mr. Hart was like a riptide, strong and silent, dragging her away from the safe shore of rules and consequences. It was a dangerous pull, a thrilling, terrifying force that made her old life of perfect order and predictable achievements feel colorless and flat. The foundation of who she was, the girl who believed in rules above all else, was beginning to crumble, not from a single blow, but from the constant, gentle, irresistible pressure of a forbidden admiration that was slowly, surely, turning into something far more potent and perilous. The blueprint was not just smudged now, it was being redrawn by a hand that was not her own, and she was powerless to stop it. The debate team became the secret axis upon which Emma's world now spun. What had once been empty, predictable hours after school were now filled with a purpose that felt electric and illicit. The meetings were held in the library, a vast, hushed space that smelled of aging paper and polished wood. The formal sessions with the rest of the team were one thing, a whirlwind of research, constructing arguments, and practicing rebuttals under Mr. Hart's guided, professional eye. But it was the private strategy sessions, the ones he insisted were necessary to prepare their captain, that became the crucible for everything unsaid. These were the moments that stretched, warping time itself, transforming the quiet library corner into a universe of two. It was during one such evening, a week before the regional competition, that the careful scaffolding they had built around their professional relationship began to splinter. The rest of the team had departed with waves and good nights, their chatter fading down the hallway until the only sound was the low hum of the library's ventilation system. Outside, the sky had deepened from twilight to a velvety, ink-blue night, the large windows reflecting the interior of the room back at them, creating a ghostly double exposure of shelves and tables. Emma and Mr. Hart were surrounded by a fortress of open books, legal pads scrawled with notes, and empty coffee cups. They were working on their final argument, a passionate plea about the power of words to shape reality. The key, he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur in the quiet, is to make them feel it. It can't just be logical. It has to connect here. He tapped a fist lightly against his chest. You have to believe the words yourself, Emma. You have to channel them, not just recite them. She was trying to focus on the text in front of her, but her awareness was entirely consumed by his proximity. He had taken off his suit jacket earlier, and his white shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing the corded muscles of his forearms. The top button was undone, and she found her eyes drawn to the small, vulnerable patch of skin at the base of his throat. The air between them was no longer just still, it was charged, heavy with a tension that had been building for weeks, a current that hummed just beneath the surface of every word about rhetoric and persuasion. He moved from his chair to stand beside her, leaning over her shoulder to point at a line she had written. His scent, that familiar mix of crisp cotton and something uniquely him, enveloped her. This phrase here, he said, his finger hovering just above the paper. It's clever, but it's safe. You're playing it safe. His breath was warm against her ear. Don't be safe, Emma. Not with this. What are you really trying to say? His question felt layered, aimed not just at the debate case, but at the very core of her. She felt a tremor start in her hands and willed it to stop, lifting her gaze from the paper to meet his. The intensity in his brown eyes was overwhelming, a storm of unspoken thoughts and awareness that mirrored her own. The reflection of the two of them was caught in the dark window, a perfect, silent tableau of teacher and student, an image that was about to be shattered. I'm trying to say that some desires are so powerful, they feel like truths, she whispered, the words leaving her lips before her mind could censor them. It was no longer about the debate. A profound silence descended, so absolute she could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. The professional distance between them evaporated in that single, breathless moment. Mr. Hart's expression shifted, the teacherly mask dissolving into something raw and utterly open. He slowly straightened up, but he didn't move away. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing the young woman behind the brilliant student, seeing the turbulent, forbidden emotions she could no longer hide. Emma, he said, her name a soft, pained exhale. He reached out then, his movement achingly slow, as if fighting against an invisible force. His fingers, warm and sure, brushed against her temple, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was fleeting, a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt of pure, undiluted lightning through her entire nervous system. Her skin tingled where his fingers had been, the sensation blooming and spreading, heating her blood. It was the first time he had ever touched her, and it was the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. His hand didn't fully retreat. It hovered near her cheek, his thumb tracing a slow, perilous path along her cheekbone. His eyes were locked on hers, dark and full of a turbulent conflict that she felt echoing deep within herself. The world outside the library, the school, the rules, the certain ruin that awaited them, faded into a distant, unimportant haze. There was only his touch, his gaze, and the deafening sound of her own ragged breathing. He leaned in. She leaned in. Their faces were now mere inches apart, so close she could feel the warmth of his skin, see the flecks of gold in his deep brown eyes, the faint lines of tension around them. She could see the battle raging within him, the war between what was right and what, in this charged, silent moment, felt utterly inevitable. His gaze dropped to her lips, and her own parted slightly in a silent, willing invitation. The space between them was a live wire, crackling with a promise that was both terrifying and all-consuming. She could feel the pull, a physical, magnetic force drawing them together, erasing every rule, every consequence, every single reason why this could not, must not, happen. And then, it broke. He jerked back as if scolded, his hand dropping to his side, his fingers curling into a tight fist. He took 2 full steps back, putting a desperate, physical barrier between them. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression a landscape of shock and self-recrimination. God, he breathed, the word harsh in the quiet room. He wouldn't look at her now. Emma, you need to go home. Right now. The spell was violently broken, leaving a cold, stark reality in its wake. The warmth that had flooded her was replaced by a wave of icy mortification and a crushing sense of loss. She could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. She gathered her things with trembling hands, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. She didn't look at him again as she fled the library, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway like a frantic, fleeing heartbeat. The almost kiss hung in the air of the silent library, a ghost between them, a line they had not crossed but had come so terrifyingly close to obliterating. The door was still closed, but it was no longer locked. They had both seen what was on the other side, and neither of them would ever be able to forget it. The days that followed the incident in the library were a study in excruciating tension. A new, fragile, and painfully deliberate dance began between Emma and Mr. Hart, a choreography of avoidance and stolen glances that was more telling than any conversation could have been. In the classroom, he was the picture of professional detachment, his gaze carefully skimming over her as if she were just another student, his voice losing its personal warmth when he addressed her. He called on her less, and when he did, his responses were clipped, efficient, and devoid of the intellectual spark that had once flown between them. It was a wall, hastily constructed and transparently thin, but a wall nonetheless. Emma felt every inch of this new distance like a physical chill. The vibrant, sun-drenched world of his classroom had turned gray and cold. She retreated into herself, the model student once more, her head bent over her notes, but the words on the page were meaningless symbols. Her mind was a relentless replay of that single, searing moment, the touch of his fingers, the warmth of his breath, the devastating pull of the space between their lips. The debate team meetings became a special kind of torture. They were both hyper-aware of the other's presence, their interactions strained and overly polite in front of the other students. He would address the team as a whole, his instructions general, his eyes never quite meeting hers for more than a fleeting second. The easy collaboration was gone, replaced by a stilted formality that did not go unnoticed by the more observant members of the team. Emma performed her duties as captain with a robotic efficiency, her arguments clever but soulless, the passion he had once praised now locked away behind the wall he had built. It was during one of these tense, joyless sessions, as she was packing her bag amidst the chatter of her departing teammates, that she noticed it. A single, folded square of paper, not her own, had been slipped between the pages of her copy of the team's casebook. Her heart stuttered. With a furtive glance around, she palmed it, the simple act feeling as dangerous as a secret rendezvous. She didn't open it until she was alone, locked in the sterile silence of a bathroom stall. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It wasn't a love letter. There was no name, no salutation. It was just a single line, written in his familiar, sharp script. Asterisk, a persuasive argument requires a calm mind. Breathed out asterisk, that was all. But it was a thread, a tiny, fragile lifeline thrown across the chasm he had created. He had seen her distress, her robotic performance, and he had reached out in the only way he safely could. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a declaration. It was an acknowledgement. He was still there, watching, and he cared. The ice around her heart cracked, just a little. Thus began their secret language, a silent conversation conducted in the spaces between the rules. The notes became their currency, their only form of true communication. They were never left in obvious places, never handed directly to one another. She found the next one 2 days later, tucked into the specific volume of romantic poetry he had recommended to her in the school library, a book she had checked out and he knew she was reading. His message was again brief, a commentary on the text. Wordsworth understood that the most profound truths are often felt, not explained. She spent hours turning that line over in her mind, wondering if he was still talking about poetry. Her replies were just as cautious, just as coded. She left a note for him in the debate team's shared folder, clipped to a schedule he would inevitably review. She wrote, her handwriting deliberately steady, I find I understand the romantics much better now. The intensity of feeling is no longer abstract. It was a risk, a confession disguised as an academic insight. The next day, a new note awaited her. This one slipped into the sleeve of her laptop when she left it unattended for a moment in the empty classroom. His response was bolder, the subtext shimmering just beneath the surface. The most dangerous stories are not those of monsters, but those of relatable desire. They make us wonder what we would do in the same situation. This clandestine exchange became the new center of her existence. The public coldness between them no longer felt like a rejection, but a necessary performance, a shield to protect the fragile, precious world they were building with these pieces of paper. Every note was a secret shared, a confirmation that the connection she felt had not been a figment of her imagination, that it was real and powerful enough for him to risk everything to maintain it in this hushed, paper and ink form. The fear of being discovered was a constant, low thrum of anxiety in her veins, but it was inextricably linked to a thrilling, addictive euphoria. They were building a castle out of whispers, a delicate, beautiful, and terribly fragile structure that existed entirely in the margins of their sanctioned lives. In the silence of their public estrangement, they were having the most important conversation of their lives, and every folded piece of paper was a brick in the wall they were constructing against the world that told them they could not, and should not, be. The autumn air had turned crisp and carried the sharp, clean scent of decaying leaves, a constant reminder of the inevitable change that was settling over everything. The annual homecoming football game was a pillar of the school's tradition, a night of roaring crowds, blazing stadium lights, and a pervasive, buzzing school spirit that Emma had always found comforting in its predictable chaos. This year, however, she felt utterly detached from it all, a ghost moving through the celebrations. She stood with Sarah and a group of friends in the bleachers, the aluminum cold even through her jeans, her cheers for the team feeling hollow and performed. The noise of the crowd was a dull roar in her ears, a sound that seemed to push her deeper into her own isolation. Her eyes, as they had done all evening, scanned the periphery of the field, past the players and the cheerleaders, searching for a single, specific silhouette. And then she found him. He was standing alone, away from the clusters of teachers and parents, beneath the skeletal branches of a large oak tree just beyond the reach of the stadium lights. He was just a dark, still shape, his hands in the pockets of his coat, watching the game with a quiet intensity that separated him from the festive atmosphere. Seeing him there, isolated in his own world, sent a fresh, acute pang of longing through her. It was a physical ache, a pull so strong it felt like a tether connected from her heart directly to his. The distance between the bleachers and that tree felt like an impossible chasm, one defined by rules and roles and watching eyes. She spent the next quarter of the game in a state of quiet agony, her body in the stands, her entire being focused on that solitary figure under the tree, the roar of the crowd fading into a meaningless static. Then, the sky, which had been threatening all evening, finally broke. It started as a fine mist, then quickly escalated into a steady, cold downpour. A collective groan went up from the crowd, followed by a chaotic scramble as thousands of people surged for cover under the bleachers and toward the school building. The orderly game dissolved into a laughing, shrieking mess of fleeing spectators. In the confusion, a reckless, wild impulse seized Emma. It was a now or never feeling, a product of weeks of pent-up emotion and silent, paper-based confessions. While her friends ducked and ran for cover, she did the opposite. She broke from the group, descending the slick metal steps and starting to run, not toward the school, but across the wet, trampled grass of the field, directly toward the oak tree. The rain soaked through her sweater instantly, plastering her hair to her face and neck, the cold drops stinging her skin. She was breathless by the time she reached the shelter of the tree's thick branches, which provided only a partial respite from the deluge. He turned as she approached, his expression shifting from surprise to something far more complex, alarm, concern, and a flicker of that same raw intensity she had seen in the library. "Emma," he said, his voice tight with strain. "You should be with your friends. You're going to catch a cold." She was trembling, but not from the cold. She stood before him, soaked and desperate, the rain creating a curtain of privacy around them, the sound of the downpour muffling their words from the world. This was it. The pretense was over. The notes had been the prologue, and this stormy, isolated pocket of the night was the moment of truth. "I can't do this anymore," she blurted out, her voice shaking, her words tumbling out in a rushed, breathless confession. "The pretending. The ignoring me in class. It's killing me. I think about you all the time. Every second. I can't focus, I can't sleep." Her courage faltered for a moment under the weight of his stunned gaze, but she forced herself to finish. "It's all I see when I close my eyes." Mr. Hart, Cole, stood perfectly still, the conflict she had witnessed before now a full-scale war on his face. The rain dripped from the dark strands of his hair onto his forehead. He looked tormented, his jaw clenched tight. The professional wall he had so carefully maintained was crumbling right before her eyes, eroded by the sheer, desperate force of her honesty and the isolating power of the storm. "Emma," he began, his voice a low, ragged thing, strained with the effort of holding back. "You don't understand what you're saying, the consequences. I'm your teacher. I could lose everything. I could ruin you." "It's too late," she whispered, taking a small, daring step closer, closing the gap between them. The space was now charged, electric, just as it had been in the library. "Don't you feel it? It's already too late for that." That was the final crack in his resolve. Her words, her proximity, her utterly vulnerable and determined state broke through the last of his defenses. A low, pained sound escaped him, a surrender. "I know," he admitted, his voice dropping, the gravelly tone thick with emotion. He finally, truly looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her rain-soaked face, and the last vestiges of the teacher fell away, leaving just a man, utterly captivated and overwhelmed. "God, help me, I know. I try not to. I have tried every single day since I first saw you. But I can't. You are all I see, Emma. In every room. In every thought." He didn't kiss her. The moment was too profound, too raw for that. Instead, he reached out and his hand found hers in the space between them. His fingers, warm and strong despite the cold rain, laced through her chilled ones, holding her hand with a firm, desperate certainty. It was not the fleeting, accidental touch from before. This was a deliberate, conscious connection, a silent vow that passed between their clasped hands. They stood there, hidden by the rain and the shadows, hands locked together, the sounds of the retreating game and the cheering crowd a distant, irrelevant world away. In that single, simple, profound gesture, everything was admitted. Every unspoken word and every secret note, every stolen glance, every moment of agonizing tension, it all coalesced into the firm, warm pressure of his hand in hers. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased, washed away by the rain, leaving only the undeniable, terrifying, and exhilarating truth of what they were to each other. The forbidden love was no longer a secret they kept from the world, it was a secret they now shared completely, and the weight of it was both terrifying and the most real thing either of them had ever known. The world, as it always does, eventually intrudes upon even the most perfectly sealed private universes. The rain that had felt like a blessing, a divine curtain shielding their confession, had also been a witness. A witness with eyes, and a phone, and a penchant for gossip. The rumor did not explode, it seeped, a slow, insidious poison into the hallways of the school. It began as a whisper, a knowing look in the cafeteria, a sudden silence when Emma walked into a room. It was in the way her friend Sarah could no longer meet her gaze, her concern having hardened into a disappointed resignation. It was in the overly cautious, almost pitying tone her math teacher used when asking her a question, as if she were suddenly fragile. The castle of whispers they had built was under siege, and the walls were proving to be paper-thin. Emma moved through her days in a state of high alert, every nerve ending raw, her stomach a tight knot of dread. The stolen moments, the electric thrill of his hand in hers, were now overshadowed by the constant, chilling fear of a footstep behind her, a voice calling her name with official finality. The inevitable summons came not for her, but for him. She heard it through the school grapevine, a tidbit of hushed, thrilling news. Mr. Hart had been called into the principal's office during his free period, and he had been in there for a very long time. That day, literature class was taught by a grim-faced substitute who knew nothing of Wordsworth or the power of unspoken desire. The empty desk at the front of the room was a more powerful statement than any lecture could ever be. It was a void, a physical manifestation of the consequences they had dared to flirt with. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The axe was falling. She spent the hour staring at that empty space, feeling a cold, certain doom settle in her bones. The blueprint of her perfect future was not just smudged or redrawn, it was being set on fire before her very eyes. She avoided the library, the debate team room, all their former haunts, terrified of what she might find, or not find. She took a different route to her car, a longer, more exposed path that felt somehow safer than the secluded hallway near his classroom. But he was waiting for her there, leaning against the brick wall near the student parking lot, his posture etched with a defeat she had never seen in him before. The sight of him, so visibly diminished, was a physical blow. He looked up as she approached, his eyes haunted, the usual light in them extinguished. "Emma," he said, his voice flat and tired. He didn't need to say much. He told her he had been asked to resign. That there was no concrete proof, no formal accusation, just a preponderance of concern for the learning environment and her well-being. The system, he explained with a bitter twist to his mouth, was designed to avoid scandal, not to uncover truth. He had not fought it. To fight it would have meant dragging her name through the mud, subjecting her to interviews and scrutiny, making her the center of a story that would define her long after high school was over. "I won't do that to you," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers, filled with a pained, protective resolve. "I've requested an immediate transfer. There's a school on the other side of the state. They need a teacher mid-year. It's done." The words were a final, sealing verdict. It's done. This was not the dramatic, star-crossed ending of a tragic poem. It was a quiet, administrative death. A transfer. A resignation. It was so mundane, so brutally practical, that it made the epic scale of her feelings for him feel foolish and childish. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, followed quickly by another. She didn't sob, she stood perfectly still, silently crumbling inside. He reached out, not to hold her hand, but to gently wipe a tear away with his thumb, a final, fleeting touch that felt like both a memory and a goodbye. "This was never your downfall, Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to break him. "You are going to do extraordinary things. This was my mistake. My obsession. Remember the girl you were before I ever walked into that classroom. That is the girl who is going to conquer the world." He gave her one last, long look, a look that tried to memorize her face, to sear this final moment into his soul. And then, he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. She stood there, rooted to the spot, watching him go until he turned a corner and disappeared from her view, not just from the parking lot, but from her life. The silence he left behind was absolute, a void more profound than any she had ever known. The downfall was not in the scandal or the rumors. It was in this quiet, devastating return to order. It was in the understanding that the most profound, life-altering experience of her youth would now be relegated to a secret, a story she could never tell. She had learned the world's most painful lesson, that some loves are not meant to be lived out in the open, but only to be felt in the shadows, their beauty and their pain forever intertwined, a bittersweet scar on the heart that would never fully fade. She had followed the rules to the letter her whole life, and the one time she dared to break them, she discovered a passion that was as real as it was ruinous, a love that was both her awakening and her end. And so, their story closes, a tale of a forbidden connection that burned too brightly to last. But the world is full of such stories, of hearts colliding against the boundaries of what is allowed. If you found yourself captivated by Emma and Mr. Hart's journey, if your own heart ached with the intensity of their impossible choice, then you understand the power of a love that defies the rules. There are countless other tales waiting to be told, stories of passion, secrets, and the choices that define us. To discover them, all you need to do is subscribe.